Good afternoon, and I'll begin with part 2 of human virtues, the unit on human virtues. We're today going to study points of Alasdair MacIntyre. He's talking about relativity of values. In contemporary era, Alasdair MacIntyre is recognized as a major figure who has worked towards the revival of interest in virtue ethics and also ethics of care, which gives importance to the body with regard to the conduct of human beings. Alasdair MacIntyre is a Scottish-born philosopher who was well known for reintroducing virtue ethics as described by Aristotle into mainstream of philosophy again. MacIntyre, in fact, taught at several universities in Britain as well as the United States, and his early political allegiances were oriented towards Marxism, and he even went on to publish a book on Marxism in 1953. However, over a period of time, MacIntyre got disillusioned with Marxism as it did not address the violations of morality that was occurring in Marxist regimes, especially, the view of Stalin and every other form of modern liberal individualism. MacIntyre thought it best to re-examine Aristotle's virtue ethics to reinforce and renew the concept of moral agency. MacIntyre did that by publishing 3 books in the coming decades, which re-looked at virtue ethics from a different perspective. The 3 major books which he wrote are After Virtue, which was published in 1981, Whose Justice, Which Rationality in 1988, and Dependent Rational Beings in 1999. All of these books of MacIntyre have or take a re-look at virtue ethics from a different perspective. In the 3 books, MacIntyre went on to argue that moral philosophy was actually in danger and it needed to be reorganized. Now, the reason he thought that it needed to be reorganized was because different schools of moral philosophy had absolutely no platform on which they could come together and discuss common issues. The other reason that he felt that moral philosophy was disorganized was because the different moral theories that had been presented post-Enlightenment, according to him, were inconsistent and confused. MacIntyre had the theories of Kant, Henry Sidgwick, and G. E. Moore in mind when he said that different moral theories or philosophies that had been presented post-Enlightenment were inconsistent and confused, because he felt that each of these theories which had been put forward by Kant, Sidgwick, and G. E. Moore had failed to distinguish between fact and value. The different perspectives of morality, according to him, cannot be worked out if thinkers have different conceptual frameworks about rationality, and he felt that whether it was Kant, whether it was Sidgwick, or whether it was G. E. Moore, each one of them examined and assessed the conceptual framework of rationality or reason as it was possessed by human beings from a very different perspective. And each perspective of each philosopher was different. So there was no common ground or framework on which these philosophers could actually come through and discuss and sort the problem as he felt there was. As each school was distinct in its approach and was critical of the other, dialogue between them, according to MacIntyre, appeared to be a distant possibility. Therefore, moral pluralism itself became a challenge. The fact that moral pluralism remains a distant possibility was because MacIntyre believed that Enlightenment thinkers had failed to see that even if human beings were using reason, still it was not possible that they would all arrive at an objective version of truth. The fact that we are rational beings and we exercise our reasoning and understanding gives no guarantee that each one of us will arrive at an objective version of truth. He felt, in fact, that the truth or the version of truths that was available were each presented from an individual's perspective, and there was no such thing as an objective version of truth that was being talked about, and the Enlightenment thinkers had actually failed to recognize that an objective version of truth was hard to come by. This fact that there is no objective truth was in fact highlighted by Hume, Kant, and even by Nietzsche. Further, the works of contemporary continental philosophers, and in fact later Wittgenstein, all helped in destroying the belief that there is an objective truth. They all went on to challenge this very concept or notion that there is an objective truth which is available out there and which is accessible and which can be known, and it can be known when human beings or man or the individual goes on to analyze or assess or apply his rationality or reasoning capacities. In fact, in his book, Dependent Rational Animals, Why Human Beings Need the Virtues, McIntyre affirms that morality cannot be taught outside of biology. Why is that so? Because in his opinion, insofar as human person is an embodied being, he's not just simply a pure rational mind. Rather, he's a combination of both. Therefore, it is, according to him, it is not what has been presented in the framework of dualistic philosophy, where mind and body have been presented as two different substances. For McIntyre, it is not that case. Rather, man or human being is an embodied being, where mind and body together go on to form the entire persona of a human being. McIntyre believed that virtues change according to the context, a fact that post-Enlightenment moral thinkers failed to see. Now, he believed that as virtues change, as per the context, he thought that the post-Enlightenment thinkers had failed somehow to see this, that the description or definition of virtues is constantly changing. There is no fixed definition, or you could say implication of what virtues stand for. The reason being, there were three rival theories that had been dominating the moral discourse until then. And he said the reason that virtues change according to the context was something which had not been noticed by the Enlightenment moral thinkers, was because there were three rival theories that had been dominating the entire moral discourse. And these were basically theories that were either centered around tradition or encyclopedia or genealogy. Tradition. Now, McIntyre points out how each philosophical position is rooted in some tradition. In fact, what he's saying here is that whenever we look at any philosophical school, there is some tradition that it is rooted in or it is firmly based on. And it is only when a philosophical position or a school identifies with a tradition that they go on to form a moral perspective. So this question or this aspect that there is a timeless moral reason is somehow, according to McIntyre, not acceptable, because each philosophical position operates from some tradition into which it is deeply rooted. In After Virtue, in fact, he goes on to ask whether it was right to reject Aristotle. He also states that Nietzsche was right in stating that there is no common human nature. Nietzsche went on to say that so far as we go on in search of common human nature, well, then we'll have to keep on searching, because according to Nietzsche, there is no such thing as a common human nature which is universally present amongst each and every human being and which can be identified and known immediately. Most modern moral theories, according to McIntyre, failed to see that the connection between modernity and tradition is a tenuous one. It is something which is like a tightrope walk. Encyclopedia. Now, McIntyre uses this term to cover Enlightenment thinkers as well as post-Enlightenment thinkers. He includes amongst them Mill, Kant, Moore, Karl Marx, and also Darwin. All of them, according to him, failed to note that their theories were not in fact describing human nature, which would be valid for all times and all places. So McIntyre went on to criticize these important Enlightenment thinkers, post-Enlightenment thinkers, John Stuart Mill, Kant, Moore, Karl Marx, and also early Darwin, because according to him, each one of them, the theories that they presented, the moral theories that they presented, the moral principles that they presented, whereby, according to them, societies could function if they adopted them as universal moral principles, would be workable, was something that McIntyre felt was not possible at all. Why? Because they failed to realize that neither of their theories were in fact describing human nature, which would be valid for all times and all places. Because McIntyre himself probably did not believe that there is a human nature which is valid for all times and all places. Genealogy. McIntyre used this term to explain that moral values are not objective, rather they are subjective expressions. Here, he is discussing moral relativism, that is, modern in perspective, and takes some ideas from Nietzsche and emotivism. Now, McIntyre has used the term genealogy to explain what? Well, his standpoint that moral values are not objective, rather they are subjective expressions. And here he is diversifying from the standpoint that had been adopted by Kant, by Mill, G.E. Moore, and where he says that why does every moral theorist, or why is it that these moral theories went on in search for moral values that were objective? Because according to him, each of the moral values are taken from or spoken or referring to subjective expressions. So he takes some ideas from both Nietzsche and the emotivist theory and says that moral ideas are not objective like facts are. As McIntyre stated, virtues change as per context. For instance, in the period of Homer, say, for example, physical strength was considered to be the virtue, whereas in the period of Athens, moral integrity was considered as a virtue, and whereas during the Middle Ages, spiritual strength was considered to be the virtue. Now, in these examples that McIntyre has given, what is it that one is noticing? Well, one is noticing that how the definition of virtue has changed as per the context and as the period. If during Homer's time, it was brute physical strength, well, that changed to moral integrity in the period of Athens, maybe at the time of Aristotle. And then that same definition of virtue changed in the Middle Ages, where it was more of spiritual strength, which was considered to be a virtue. That means that there was no constant definition of virtue that could span across millennia, across cultures, and that would be universal and necessary and applicable to all people at all points of time. And that is the point that McIntyre is reiterating time and again. If virtues change as per the context, then it is difficult to judge which moral tradition is better than the other. Now, the question that has been constantly being asked or raised in this entire unit is that if virtues are changing as per the context, then how are we to determine which moral tradition is better than the other? Because for each moral tradition, there are certain virtues that form the bedrock from which we are going to assess the moral traditions vis-a-vis each other. So what did McIntyre do? Well, McIntyre took a very relativist position that virtues are, according to him, relative. He went on to conclude that these differences amongst the virtues can be attributed to different practices that have generated different conceptions of virtue. Like it was stated in the earlier example, in some it was physical strength, in some it was moral integrity, and in some it was spiritual qualities. So one is seeing that as per the context and the time period, virtues have been evolving. So McIntyre went on to adopt the position that virtues are relative. Each account of virtue, according to him, requires a prior account of the social and moral features that need to be understood. So, in order to understand why is it that virtues are changing as per the context, or as per the circumstance. According to McIntyre, we really need to make a study of the social and the moral features of that point of time. Thus, in order to understand Homeric virtue, we need to look at the social roles in Greek society. Virtues then are exercised within practices and social forms of activity that are coherent and seek to realize goods that are internal to that activity. So what are virtues? Well, virtues are those which are exercised within practices and within certain social forms of activity. And they go on to form a coherent theme, and they seek to realize goods that are internal to that activity. Now we go on to analyze McIntyre's philosophy and his view of the fact that virtues are, according to him, relative. If one were to look at the broad aspects of McIntyre's philosophy, one comes across the view that for him, ethics was more about understanding moral decisions than finding an absolute rule for choosing how to behave in a similar case. It is relativistic in terms. So McIntyre's philosophy is putting forward the view that ethics has got more to do with understanding moral decisions rather than finding an absolute rule which would be applicable and which would help us in deciding to choose how we are going to behave across situations or in similar cases. Kelvin Knight, in his book Aristotelian Philosophy, Ethics in Politics, From Aristotle to McIntyre, Polity Press 2007, has in fact explained that how the epistemological theories of modern moral philosophy were supposed to provide a rational basis for rules, policies, and practical determinations based on abstract concepts. However, McIntyre rejected all these theories, and in After Virtue and every other publication that followed it, modern meta-ethics expects thinkers to adopt a neutral position vis-a-vis conflicting moral traditions. McIntyre even rejected the modern meta-ethical approach. His reasons for rejecting the modern meta-ethical approach were to understand how each individual can free himself from adopting a perspective based on some moral tradition simply out of blind faith. The human agent, according to him, should be, on the other hand, should be able to understand what is good for him and given his own circumstances and operate accordingly. So for McIntyre, it is important that each human being should understand the condition and the moral tradition and the rules that are being spelled out and on the basis of which he is acting. And he must act for what is good for him, given the circumstances. For McIntyre, his philosophy is not another project in epistemology or a part of virtue ethics. In fact, his view of morality is to let the human agent understand what is human good and how can one go about seeking that good. In other words, what path should one adopt to seek one's good, whatever definition of that good may be. McIntyre is in fact resurrecting an older form of morality, as the theories post-Enlightenment had failed in providing a moral framework that is workable. Thus, McIntyre arrived at the conclusion that one needs to revisit and reinterpret ethics as it had been outlined by Aristotle and later integrated into Christianity by Thomas Aquinas. McIntyre reintroduces the idea of telos or ends. There is an end, according to him, that transcends all particular practices, and it constitutes the good of a whole human life. His approach to ethics is more in terms of understanding moral decisions rather than in finding an absolute rule for choosing how to behave in any similar case. McIntyre's approach is relativistic in terms of morality and believes it useless to try to determine absolute rules of conduct, either through Kantian categorical imperative or utilitarian calculation of maximizing welfare. He was also critical of emotivism as a moral theory. The reason McIntyre rejected emotivism was because it was circular in its presentation of moral rules. Emotivism failed to make a distinction between normal approval and moral approval. Normal approval is when I state my preferences, and moral approval is when I seek reasons, ethical reasons for doing or following a certain action. It is independent of people and situations. Thus, the course of history has left us with a host of moral theories, but no universal standard by which we can evaluate these theories. Therefore, McIntyre presents his own interpretation of Aristotle's concept of telos and eudaimonia. McIntyre describes the provisional telos as the good life for man is the life spent in seeking for the good life for man, and the virtues necessary for the seeking are those which will enable us to understand what more and what else the good life for man is. The distinction between internal good and external good is important. Why? Because it will help us in deciding which telos or ends we ought to pursue. McIntyre is critical of the West and its focus on external goods and the institutions. According to him, the institutions are needed, no doubt, to manage practices, but they have put too much emphasis on external goods, and that can oftentimes lead to corruption. Thus, in this unit, we find different approaches to human virtues. We began by understanding and analyzing Aristotle's concept of virtue and eudaimonia. We then looked at how, in contemporary times, the same concept was revived by Alasdair MacIntyre to understand morality and moral principles. The basic contention of virtue ethics is that moral actions are derived from virtues. MacIntyre reinforces this concept by reintroducing virtue ethics of Aristotle and stating that if man has to achieve good, then he has to practice living virtuously. Thank you. I'm Dr. Sudhnya N. Kulkarni, Associate Professor, Philosophy Department, Janki Devi Memorial College, University of Delhi.